Breaking update this morning. The suspect, police say, is involved in the deaths of two USF doctoral students is facing new murder charges this morning. Hillsborough County deputies are now charging Hashim Abu Garbia with 2 counts of murder in the first degree with a weapon in the deaths of Zamil Limon and Nahida Bristy. Right now, a desperate search is underway to still find Bristy, and in just hours, Abu Garbia will face a judge. Here's what we know so far. The body of Zamil Limon was found on the Howard Franklin Bridge yesterday morning. Right now, his friend, Nahida Bristy, she is still missing. The last time anyone saw Zamil and Nahida, both doctoral students at the University of South Florida, was on April 16th.
Call up the first case, Hasham Abu Garbi, Falkenberg and Orient. Can you hear me?
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning. Michael Rivera, Office of Public Defender at Orient Road, off camera.
All right. And do I have Hasham Abu Garbi here?
He's present. I think he's off to the side, Your Honor.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Mr. Abu Garbi, you have been charged with...
And Your Honor, I'll waive the reading of the charges, please.
Okay. Thank you.
She trusted him, and that trust cost her everything. What happened to Nahida Bristy is not just disturbing. It's the kind of crime that stays with you long after you hear it. Before we go any further, welcome to Global Pulse Report, where we uncover the darkest crimes, the hidden truths, and the stories many try to forget. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because this one is not just another case. It begins in what many would describe as a normal, quiet neighborhood. The kind of place where children still play outside, where neighbors recognize each other, where danger feels distant, almost impossible. And right at the center of that normal life was a young girl named Nahida Bristy. She was known as cheerful, innocent, and full of life. The kind of child who didn't carry fear in her heart. The kind of child who trusted easily, because she had never been given a reason not to. On the day everything changed, nothing seemed out of place. Nahida stepped out like she had done many times before. No signs of panic. No signs of danger. Just another ordinary moment in what should have been an ordinary day. But that was the moment everything quietly shifted. Because somewhere nearby, someone was watching. Someone who already knew her. Someone who understood her routine. Someone who knew exactly how to get close without raising suspicion. That person was Zamil Limon. At first, there was no alarm. Children go out. Children come back. That's how it always works, until the one time it doesn't. As hours began to pass, something started to feel wrong. Nahida hadn't returned. Her family began asking questions. Neighbors were contacted. Friends were checked. The usual places children go, all searched. But she wasn't there. And that's when the quiet concern started turning into something heavier, something colder. Fear. The kind that creeps in slowly before it takes over completely. People in the area started to notice the tension building. A missing child changes everything. Conversations shift. Movements slow down. Eyes begin to search every corner. And then came the realization no one wanted to face. Nahida wasn't just missing. Something had happened. As word spread, the search intensified. More people joined in. The community that once felt safe now moved with urgency and dread. Every passing minute felt like it mattered. Because deep down, everyone knew time was no longer on their side. Then came the discovery. The moment that shattered any remaining hope. Nahida Bristy was found. But not alive. The scene was devastating. There are some details that don't need to be described in full to be understood. What mattered was this. The innocence that once defined her had been met with unimaginable violence. And just like that, a missing person case became a murder investigation. Shock spread quickly. Grief followed. But alongside it came something else, anger. Because this wasn't random. It didn't feel random. There were signs. Clues that suggested this wasn't an accident, not a sudden act of chaos, but something far more disturbing. Something planned. Authorities began working immediately, securing the scene, gathering evidence, reconstructing the final moments of Nahida's life. And as they started putting the pieces together, one name kept coming up. A name that wasn't unfamiliar. A name that didn't belong to a stranger. Zamil Limon. The idea that someone within reach, someone within the same environment, could be responsible, it made the situation even more terrifying. Because it meant one thing. Nahida didn't see danger coming. Investigators began digging deeper. Witnesses were questioned. Movements were tracked. Timelines were reconstructed down to the smallest detail. And slowly, a picture began to form. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't careless. There were indications that Nahida had been approached in a way that made her feel safe enough to follow. No struggle at the beginning. No immediate signs of fear. Which pointed to something chilling. Trust. The very thing that made her vulnerable was used against her. As evidence continued to build, suspicion around Zamel Limon grew stronger. His proximity, his possible interaction, the inconsistencies, all of it began to align in a way investigators couldn't ignore. The community watched closely as rumors turned into focus. People started asking the same question. How could someone like this exist so close, without anyone knowing? But the truth is, cases like this don't always come with warning signs that are easy to see. Sometimes the danger blends in. Sometimes it smiles. And sometimes it waits. By the time authorities were ready to act, the weight of the situation had already taken over the community. The fear was no longer about what happened. It was about how it happened, and who was responsible. Then came the moment that shifted everything again. Police moved in. Zamel Limon was arrested. And just like that, the case entered a new phase. One that would reveal details far darker than anyone was prepared for. Because the question was no longer just who did it. Now it became, why? And that answer would uncover something even more disturbing than the crime itself. The moment Zamel Limon was taken into custody, everything changed. What was once fear and speculation slowly began turning into answers. But those answers didn't bring relief. They made things worse. Because as investigators started questioning him, they weren't just looking for a confession. They were trying to understand the sequence of events that led to the final moments of Nahida Bristy's life. And almost immediately, cracks began to show. His initial statements didn't fully align with the evidence. There were inconsistencies, small at first, but enough to raise suspicion. The kind of contradictions that investigators are trained to notice. So they pushed harder. They went back over timelines, rechecked movements, cross-referenced witness statements. Every detail was examined again, this time with a sharper focus. And what they started uncovering painted a chilling picture. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't a sudden loss of control. There were signs that Nahida had been deliberately approached. That she had been led away from familiar surroundings without causing alarm. Which meant one thing. He didn't force trust, he used it. Investigators began to believe that Zamel Limon had taken advantage of familiarity. That he knew enough about Nahida to approach her in a way that wouldn't trigger fear. And that realization hit the community hard. Because it meant the crime didn't begin at the moment of violence. It began much earlier. With observation. With patience. With intent. As questioning continued, authorities focused on reconstructing the exact chain of events. Where did he meet her? How did he convince her to follow? What happened in those missing hours? Each answer led to more disturbing implications. Forensic findings supported the theory that Nahida had been taken to a different location, a place where there would be little to no interruption, a controlled environment. That level of movement suggested planning, and planning suggested motive. But that's where things became even more complicated, because the why didn't come easily. There was no clear, simple explanation that could justify the brutality. No sudden argument, no obvious trigger that could explain such an act. Instead, it pointed toward something darker, something internal, something that had been building long before that day. Investigators began looking into Zamel Limon's background, his behavior, his interactions, his past. They spoke to people who knew him, neighbors, acquaintances, anyone who could provide insight. And what they found was unsettling in a different way. There was nothing outwardly obvious. No major warning signs that would have predicted something like this. No clear history that screamed danger. And that's what made it more frightening, because it suggested that whatever led to this crime wasn't visible on the surface. It was hidden. As details slowly leaked to the public, reactions intensified. Social media exploded with anger. People demanded justice. Some struggled to even process how something like this could happen so close to home. The name Nahida Bristy became more than just a victim's name. It became a symbol, a reminder of how quickly safety can disappear. Meanwhile, investigators continued pressing for the full truth. They weren't just building a case, they were trying to close every gap, eliminate every doubt. Because in crimes like this, every detail matters. Every timeline must match. Every piece of evidence must connect. And as the pressure increased, so did the weight on the suspect. At some point during interrogation, the resistance began to weaken. The inconsistencies became harder to maintain. The gaps in his story became impossible to defend. And then the version of events started to shift. What came out wasn't a single clean confession, but a gradual unraveling. Piece by piece, detail by detail, until the reality of what happened began to take shape. It confirmed what investigators feared from the beginning. Nahida had been targeted. This wasn't chance. It wasn't coincidence. She had been chosen. That realization changed everything, because it meant the crime carried intent from the very start. And intent carries weight in the eyes of the law. As authorities prepared the case, they focused on building a timeline that would hold up in court. Every movement, every interaction, every moment accounted for. The prosecution would need more than emotion. They would need proof. And they were gathering it. Forensic evidence, witness statements, behavioral patterns, all of it being organized into a case that would speak for someone who no longer could. At the same time, the emotional toll on Nahida's family deepened. Grief turned into something heavier. The kind of pain that doesn't just come from loss, but from knowing how that loss happened. The kind of pain that asks questions that don't have answers. Why her? Why like this? Why someone she trusted? Those questions echoed far beyond the family. They spread through the entire community. Because once a crime like this happens, it changes how people see everything. Trust becomes harder. Normal routines feel different. Even familiar faces start to feel uncertain. And at the center of it all was a single truth that no one could escape. This didn't have to happen, but it did. And now the focus was no longer just on understanding the crime. It was on ensuring justice. Because as the investigation moved closer to completion, one thing became clear. This case was strong. Strong enough to move forward. Strong enough to hold him accountable. But the final phase, the one that would decide everything, was still ahead. The courtroom, where every detail would be examined again. Where every action would be questioned, where the story of Nahida Bristy would be told, not just as a tragedy, but as evidence. And in that room, the truth would face judgment. The courtroom was silent, but it wasn't calm. There's a difference. Silence, in cases like this, carries weight. It holds grief, anger, and a kind of tension that never fully disappears. Every person in that room knew why they were there. Because of what happened to Nahida Bristy. And because of the man sitting at the center of it all, Zamel Limon. By the time the trial phase began, the investigation had already laid out a clear and deeply disturbing narrative. Now, it was about presenting that narrative in a way the law could measure, piece by piece, fact by fact. The prosecution didn't rush. They couldn't afford to. Cases like this demand precision.
Hisham Abu Gharbi, Falkenberg and Orient, can you hear me?
Yes, Your Honor. Good morning. Michael Rivera, Office of Public Defender at Orient Road, off camera.
They began by reconstructing the timeline, carefully walking through the final known movements of Nahida's life. Where she was last seen. Who saw her? What changed in those critical moments before she disappeared? Each detail was placed in front of the court like a fragment of something much bigger. Because when those fragments came together, they told a story no one in that room could ignore. Witnesses were called. Some spoke with certainty. Others with emotion that was difficult to contain. Neighbors, locals, individuals who had seen small but important details, movements that seemed insignificant at the time but now carried meaning. And then came the evidence. Not dramatic. Not exaggerated. Just clear. Forensic findings. Behavioral patterns. The sequence of events that pointed again and again in one direction. Toward Zamel Limon. The defense, as expected, tried to challenge the narrative. They questioned timelines. They looked for gaps. They attempted to create doubt, because in court, doubt is everything. But the difficulty was this. The pieces fit. Not perfectly at first glance, but firmly enough that pulling one apart didn't break the rest. And that made the case harder to shake. As the proceedings continued, the emotional weight in the courtroom only grew heavier. Because beyond the legal arguments, there was a reality no one could escape. A child had lost her life, and the details of how it happened were now being spoken out loud. For Nahida's family, every word was a reminder. Every statement reopened something that had never fully closed. Grief doesn't follow courtroom schedules. It doesn't wait for proceedings to end. It sits there quietly, constantly, as everything unfolds. And yet they stayed. Because this wasn't just about reliving pain. It was about facing it and demanding accountability. At some point during the trial, attention turned once again to motive. Why? It's always the question people ask. The one they hope will somehow make things make sense. But not all crimes come with answers that satisfy that question. In this case, the motive didn't arrive as a single clear explanation. There was no simple reason that could justify what happened. And that, in a way, made it even more disturbing. Because it forced everyone to confront a difficult truth. Sometimes the why doesn't bring comfort. Sometimes it only deepens the horror. As both sides presented their final arguments, the courtroom reached a kind of stillness. Not peaceful, just final. The kind of stillness that comes when everything has been said, and all that remains is judgment. The decision now rested with the court. And when that decision came, it wasn't just about one man. It was about a life that had been taken. A family that had been changed forever. A community that would never quite feel the same again. The verdict carried weight. Not because it could undo what happened, nothing could, but because it acknowledged it. It placed responsibility where it belonged. And in doing so, it delivered a form of justice. But justice, in cases like this, is complicated. It doesn't heal everything. It doesn't erase the memory. It doesn't bring back the person who was lost. What it does is draw a line. A line that says this mattered. That her life mattered. That what happened to Nahida Bristy will not be ignored. After the trial, the impact of the case didn't disappear. If anything, it stayed. People talked about it, reflected on it. Some became more protective, more aware, more cautious about who they trust. Because the reality this crime exposed was simple and deeply unsettling. Danger doesn't always look dangerous. It doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes, it's already inside the circle of trust. And that's what makes it so hard to see. The name Nahida Bristy remains more than just a headline. It's a reminder of how fragile safety can be, of how important awareness is, and of how one moment, one decision, can change everything forever. And as this case fades from the front pages, it leaves behind something that doesn't fade as easily. A question, not just about what happened, but about how many times trust is given without knowing what's truly on the other side. Because in the end, this wasn't just about a crime. It was about a truth people don't like to face. That sometimes, the person you trust the most is the one you should fear the most. If you want to stay informed with accurate, responsible reporting on global events, subscribe to Global Pulse Report and turn on notifications. Like this video to support balanced coverage, and share your thoughts in the comments, thoughtfully, respectfully, humanely. Stay informed. Stay aware. Stay vigilant.